It was a chilly autumn evening when 22-year-old Emily found herself alone in her family's large, old house. Nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the house had always been a place of comfort for Emily. With its creaking floors and dimly lit hallways, it had a charm that she loved. But tonight, that charm felt different, more ominous than ever before. Her parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving Emily in charge. She had planned to spend the night catching up on her favorite shows, curled up on the couch with a bowl of popcorn. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rooms, Emily settled in for what she expected to be a relaxing evening. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the old oak tree in the yard scratched against the glass like skeletal fingers. Emily brushed off the unease creeping into her mind, chalking it up to the weather and the eerie quietness of being alone. She turned up the volume on the TV, trying to drown out the sounds that seemed to be coming from every corner of the house. As the night wore on, Emily began to feel more on edge. The house, usually a place of warmth and safety, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. The creaks of the old wooden floors, the soft hum of the refrigerator, even the distant sound of the wind, all of it began to blend into a symphony of unease. She shook her head, trying to dispel the paranoia. "It's just your imagination," she told herself. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, she half expected to see someone standing there. Of course, no one ever was. Then, just as she began to relax again, she heard a distinct, deliberate sound that froze her in place. It was the unmistakable creak of the back door slowly opening. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She muted the TV and listened, straining to hear over the pounding of her heart. The door creaked again, then clicked shut, as if someone had gently pushed it closed. Her mind raced. Did I lock the door? I must have. But deep down, she knew she hadn't checked. She had been so focused on getting comfortable that she had completely forgotten. Her breathing grew shallow as she tried to decide what to do. The logical part of her brain told her it was just the wind, or perhaps a loose latch, but another part, the primal part, screamed that something was very wrong. The house was silent now, except for the blood rushing in her ears. She slowly rose from the couch, every instinct telling her to be as quiet as possible. She tiptoed to the hallway, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner where something or someone could be hiding. She reached for her phone on the coffee table and fumbled with it, her hands shaking. Just as she was about to dial 911, she heard another sound, a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle of feet on the floor behind her. Emily whipped around, her heart in her throat. The hallway was empty, but she could feel the presence of something nearby. Her phone slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. The noise echoed through the silent house, making her wince. She slowly backed away, her eyes wide with terror, as a figure stepped out from the shadows at the end of the hallway. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with a hood pulled low over his face. He stood there, unmoving, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. For a moment, neither of them moved. Emily's mind was screaming at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The man took a slow, deliberate step toward her, and that was enough to break her paralysis. She turned and bolted up the stairs, her bare feet slipping on the polished wood. She could hear his footsteps behind her, calm and measured, as if he knew there was no rush. Emily reached the top of the stairs and darted into her bedroom, slamming the door behind her. She locked it and pressed her back against the door, trying to catch her breath. The house was silent again, but she knew he was out there. She could feel his presence on the other side of the door. She looked around the room, desperate for something to defend herself with. Her eyes fell on a baseball bat leaning against the wall. She grabbed it, holding it tightly in her trembling hands. Minutes passed like hours. Emily listened intently, waiting for any sign that he was still there. The silence was suffocating. She began to wonder if he had left, or if he was just waiting for her to let her guard down. Then, she heard a soft, scraping sound, like metal against wood. It was coming from the door. Her blood ran cold as she realized he was trying to pick the lock. In a surge of adrenaline, Emily yanked the dresser next to her bed and pushed it against the door. She grabbed her phone from the floor and dialed 911, her fingers trembling. The operator's voice was calm, but it did little to ease Emily's terror as she whispered her address, begging them to hurry. The scraping stopped suddenly, and Emily held her breath, waiting for what felt like an eternity. The silence was deafening. She prayed the man had given up and left. The sound of sirens in the distance was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. She could see the flashing lights reflecting off the walls, growing brighter as they approached. Emily didn't dare move until she heard the police officers' voices calling out to her. When they finally broke down the door, Emily collapsed into their arms, sobbing with relief. They searched the house from top to bottom but found no trace of the intruder. The back door was wide open, swaying gently in the wind. Emily spent the night at a neighbor's house, too shaken to stay in her own. The police assured her they would investigate, but deep down, she knew they wouldn't find him. He was a shadow, a ghost, a nightmare made real. In the weeks that followed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching and waiting. Every creak, every rustle of the wind sent her heart racing. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison of fear. She never found out who the man was or what he wanted, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never feel safe alone at home again. It was a cold, rainy night in late October. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the old house where Emily lived. She had the place to herself for the weekend, as her parents had gone on a short trip out of town. The idea of having the entire house to herself initially excited Emily, but as night fell, a feeling of unease crept in. The creaks and groans of the old house seemed louder than usual, and the shadows cast by the trees outside danced eerily on the walls. Emily tried to shake off her nerves. She settled on the couch with a warm blanket, a cup of tea, and a good book. The rain continued to pour, its steady rhythm almost soothing. She was just getting into her book when she heard the first noise, a faint rustling sound, like someone moving around outside. Emily paused, holding her breath. Maybe it was just the wind. She waited, listening intently. After a few moments of silence, she convinced herself it was nothing and returned to her book. But the uneasy feeling persisted. Half an hour passed, and Emily was finally beginning to relax when she heard it again. This time, the sound was louder and closer. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. Her heart began to race as she slowly got up from the couch, trying to remain calm. She walked over to the window and carefully peeked through the curtains. The rain was coming down hard and the yard was dark, but she could just make out a figure standing near the edge of the trees. Panic surged through Emily. She quickly closed the curtains, her mind racing. Who could be out there in this weather, and why? She reached for her phone to call her parents, but then stopped herself. What would she say? That she saw someone outside? They'd probably tell her it was just her imagination. But then she heard the sound again, this time from the back of the house. It was a soft, scraping noise, like someone trying to open a window. Emily's blood ran cold. She ran to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife she could find. Her hands trembled as she clutched it tightly. She quietly moved toward the back of the house, trying to make as little noise as possible. The scraping had stopped, but she could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking around the outside of the house. Her mind raced with fear. She thought about calling the police, but what if it was nothing? What if they thought she was overreacting? Then, she heard a loud bang, a door being forced open. Emily froze in terror. Someone was inside the house. Her first instinct was to hide. She quickly dashed into the pantry, closing the door behind her as quietly as she could. The darkness surrounded her, and she held her breath, listening. She could hear the intruder's footsteps, slow and heavy, moving through the house. Each step echoed in the silence, growing closer and closer. The footsteps paused outside the pantry door. Emily's heart pounded so loudly in her chest she was sure the intruder could hear it. The door handle turned slowly, and the door creaked open. A faint light filtered in as the door swung open, revealing a tall figure standing in the doorway. The stranger didn't move for a moment, as if listening. Emily held her breath, praying they wouldn't find her. Then, the figure stepped inside. Emily's hand tightened around the knife, her mind racing with fear and adrenaline. The stranger was close now, so close she could see the glint of a blade in their hand. She knew she had to do something, but her body was paralyzed with fear. Just as the figure reached out toward her, Emily let out a scream and lunged forward, slashing wildly with the knife. The intruder jumped back, startled by the sudden attack. Emily didn't stop to see what happened next. She bolted from the pantry and ran toward the front door. Emily's heart was pounding as she sprinted down the hallway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached the front door and fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Behind her, she could hear the intruder recovering, their footsteps quickening as they chased after her. Finally, she managed to get the door open and burst outside into the cold, wet night. She didn't stop running until she reached her neighbor's house, pounding on the door and screaming for help. The police arrived within minutes, but by then the intruder was gone. They searched the house and the surrounding area but found no sign of the stranger. The only evidence left behind was the broken back door and a few muddy footprints. Emily was shaken but safe. The police stayed with her until her parents returned the next morning. They assured her that it was likely a random break-in, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the intruder had known she was alone. In the days that followed, the house was repaired and the security system was upgraded. But the sense of safety that Emily had once felt was gone. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind made her jump. She knew she would never forget the night she was alone at home and the stranger who came into her house.